My name is Devon Castellano. I'm 27. 6 months after my parents burned every college application I'd spent an entire senior year preparing, I got a call from a lawyer I'd never heard of, telling me my grandmother had left me something my parents didn't know existed, and that it changed everything about how the rest of that year would unfold. Before I explain what my grandmother had actually done, let me take you back to the night the applications burned, because none of what came after makes sense without understanding exactly how deliberate that night actually was. If you're the kind of person who watches a story through to the end instead of skipping ahead, go ahead and subscribe, only if you genuinely mean it. And drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every one. I grew up in Millport, Ohio, the older of 2 children. My father, Anthony, managed a regional distribution warehouse. My mother, Lorraine, worked as a dental hygienist. My younger brother, Nico, 3 years behind me, had always been the more athletically gifted one, a standout on the high school baseball team, the kind of kid whose games my parents never missed, whose recruiting letters from college coaches got posted on the refrigerator the moment they arrived. I was the academic one. Quiet, methodical, the kid who spent Friday nights studying instead of at parties, who'd built a 4.2 GPA across 4 years specifically because I understood, from an early age, that scholarship money was the only realistic path to the kind of college education my family couldn't otherwise afford. By senior year, I'd narrowed my applications down to 6 schools, 2 reach schools with strong pre-med tracks, 3 realistic targets with generous merit aid programs, and 1 safety school close to home. I'd spent nearly 8 months on those applications, personal essays revised a dozen times each, recommendation letters carefully requested from teachers who knew my work well, a research supplement documenting an independent biology project I'd spent the summer developing with a professor at the community college. The completed applications, along with every supporting document, sat in a single accordion folder on my desk, ready to submit through each school's online portal over the final 2 weeks before deadlines. I'd printed physical copies of everything as backup, a habit my guidance counselor had specifically recommended given how often portals glitched during peak submission season. Nico, meanwhile, had spent that same senior fall consumed by a baseball recruiting process of his own, showcases, camps, calls from college coaches, a process my parents had thrown themselves into with an intensity I'd never seen applied to anything of mine. I didn't resent his talent. I was genuinely proud of him. What I hadn't fully registered, not until much later, was how completely his recruiting timeline had started reorganizing our entire household around his needs. The night everything changed was a Thursday in early December, 9 days before my first early decision deadline. Nico had just returned from a showcase in Columbus where, according to my father, a scout from a Division II program had shown serious interest, contingent on Nico's fall semester grades improving from a concerning slide that had started around October. I came home from a study session to find my father in the kitchen, unusually quiet, my mother beside him with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Devon, we need to talk about something," my father said. "Okay. Nico's grades this semester aren't where they need to be for the Ridgemont recruiter to keep taking him seriously. The coach needs to see real improvement by the semester's end, or the offer disappears." "That's rough," I said, genuinely meaning it. "Is there anything I can help with? I could look over his chemistry notes, maybe help him study." My mother's expression shifted into something more deliberate. "We were thinking something a bit more significant than that." I didn't understand yet what more significant meant, sitting at that kitchen table, my backpack still on my shoulder, completely unprepared for the request that followed. "Nico needs more time," my father said. "More focus. Less distraction in this house. We think it would help if the house felt less competitive for a while. Less pressure on comparison." I'm not sure what that means, exactly. My mother reached across the table and set her hand over mine, in a gesture that felt, even in the moment, less like comfort and more like preparation for something I wasn't going to like. "Devon, we think you should hold off on submitting your applications this cycle. Wait a year, take a gap year, work part-time, help around the house more, and let this be Nico's year to have the family's full attention on his recruiting process without your deadlines competing for the same space." I sat very still, processing what I'd just heard. You want me to not apply to college this year? At all. Just delay it, my father said. 1 year. It's not a no, Devon. It's a pause. I have deadlines in 9 days. Some of these applications close in 9 days. Then don't submit them, my mother said, gently, as if she were suggesting I skip a minor errand rather than an entire academic year I'd spent building toward with deliberate, exhausting precision. I told them, as calmly as I could manage, that I wasn't willing to delay. That the scholarship deadlines were tied to specific application cycles, that a gap year wouldn't simply preserve my current opportunities, that Nico's recruiting process and my college applications weren't actually in competition with each other in any way that required my sacrifice. The conversation ended without resolution that night, both of us, my parents and I, retreating to separate corners of the house, the tension unspoken but unmistakable. I went to bed still planning to submit everything the following week, exactly as scheduled, believing the conversation had simply been an unusual, if uncomfortable, request I'd successfully declined. I had no idea, falling asleep that Thursday night, that less than 48 hours later, I'd walk into my bedroom and find the accordion folder containing 8 months of work sitting empty on my desk, and the fireplace downstairs still faintly smelling of smoke. I noticed it the moment I walked through the front door on Saturday evening, coming home from a study group at the library. The house smelled faintly of smoke, the kind that lingers after a fire's been out for hours, mixed with something acrid I couldn't immediately place. My mother was in the kitchen, unusually busy with dishes that didn't need washing. My father sat in the living room, watching television with a stillness that felt performed rather than relaxed. Something smells like smoke, I said. We had a fire in the fireplace earlier, my mother said, not looking up from the sink. Nico had some old notebooks he wanted to clear out. I climbed the stairs to my room without thinking much of it, some vague unease building that I couldn't yet name. I opened my bedroom door, walked to my desk, and reached for the accordion folder that had sat there, undisturbed, for the past 3 months. It was empty, not moved, not misplaced. Empty, the folder itself still sitting exactly where I'd left it, every single document that had been inside it gone. I stood there for a long moment, my mind refusing to process what I was looking at, before running back downstairs. Where are my applications? Where's everything from my desk? My father muted the television. My mother finally turned from the sink. Devon, sit down, my father said. Where are my applications? We burned them, my mother said, her voice flat, deliberate, entirely without the hesitation I might have expected from someone confessing to something that significant. Along with the printed copies. We made the decision this needed to be final, not something you could quietly go around us and submit anyway once we weren't watching. I felt the floor tilt beneath me in a way I still, years later, struggle to fully describe. 8 months of work, essays revised a dozen times, recommendation letters I'd have to request all over again, if teachers were even willing, this late in the season. A research supplement documenting an entire summer's independent project. All of it, reduced to ash in a fireplace on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, while I sat in a library 3 miles away completely unaware. You burned my future, I said, my voice shaking in a way I couldn't control. You actually burned it. We made a decision as your parents, my father said, that this family needed to prioritize differently this year. You'll thank us eventually, once you understand. I won't thank you. I will never thank you for this. Devon, lower your voice, my mother said. This isn't a tragedy. You can reapply next year, with a stronger essay, more mature perspective. Colleges love a gap year narrative. I stood in that kitchen, shaking, and understood with a clarity I'd never experienced before that my parents hadn't simply made a poor decision under pressure. They had planned this. The fire hadn't been some spontaneous act of desperation, it required waiting until I was safely out of the house, required physically removing the folder from my room, required burning not just the digital submission plans but the printed backups my guidance counselor had specifically recommended precisely to prevent this kind of loss. The recommendation letters, I said. The research supplement from Dr. Halbrook's lab. Do you understand what it took to get those? You can ask again next year, my father said. People understand these things. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bedroom floor, running through every application deadline in my head, doing rapid math on which schools might still accept late submissions with an explanation, which required physical transcripts I could potentially request directly from the school without needing anything from my desk, which recommendation letters I might be able to recover if teachers had kept digital copies of what they'd submitted. By morning, I'd identified exactly one possibility: my safety school, the one closest to home, whose rolling admissions deadline extended 3 additional weeks past my other targets. I emailed my guidance counselor before school even started, explaining, as vaguely as I could manage, that I'd experienced a family emergency that destroyed my application materials, and asking whether any accommodation existed. My counselor, a woman named Ms. Delgado, who'd worked with me closely throughout the fall, called me into her office that same day, her expression shifting from professional concern to something sharper once I explained, in more detail than I'd initially intended, exactly what had happened. "Devon, I need to say something directly. What you're describing isn't just an unfortunate accident. If your parents deliberately destroyed application materials to prevent you from submitting them, that's a serious situation, and I want you to understand you have options beyond just trying to salvage what you can for one safety school." "What options?" "I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't even know what I'd be asking a lawyer to do." Ms. Delgado was quiet for a moment, then said something that hadn't occurred to me at all in the chaos of the previous 12 hours. "Devon, does your grandmother know about any of this?" I hadn't even thought to call my grandmother, Rosalind, my father's mother, who lived 40 minutes away and who I saw regularly but hadn't spoken to since before the fireplace conversation on Thursday. "Not yet," I said. "I think you should tell her," Ms. Delgado said. "Not because I know something you don't. Just, sometimes there are people in a family who see things more clearly from a small distance, and who have more capacity to act than a 17-year-old currently does." I called my grandmother that evening, sitting in my car in the school parking lot rather than risk the conversation happening anywhere my parents could overhear it. I told her everything, my voice breaking somewhere in the middle of describing the empty folder on my desk. My grandmother was silent for a long time after I finished. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a controlled steadiness that I recognized, even then, as someone deliberately holding back a much larger reaction than what she was letting through. "Devon, listen to me very carefully. I need you to write down, right now, every single school you applied to, every deadline, every recommendation letter, everything you can remember about what was in that folder. Can you do that for me tonight?" "Why? What does that help?" "I have some resources your parents don't know about," she said. "And I think it's time I actually used them." I didn't fully understand what my grandmother meant that night, but I spent the next 4 hours in my car and then at my desk, writing down everything I could reconstruct: every school, every deadline, the exact title of my research supplement, the names of every teacher who'd written recommendation letters, even rough drafts of essay content I remembered well enough to rebuild from memory. I emailed the list to my grandmother before midnight. She called me the next morning, before school, her voice carrying a briskness I wasn't used to hearing from her. "I've made some calls," she said. "I want you to come by after school today. Don't tell your parents where you're going." I told my parents I had a study group. I drove to my grandmother's house instead, a modest ranch on the edge of town where she'd lived alone since my grandfather passed 6 years earlier. She met me at the door with a folder of her own, considerably thinner than the one I'd lost, but heavier, somehow, in what it represented. "Sit down, Devon. I need to explain some things I probably should have explained years ago." Over the next hour, my grandmother told me something that reorganized my entire understanding of my family's finances, and by extension, my father's decisions. She had, quietly, over the past 15 years, built a modest but meaningful trust fund specifically for my education, money set aside from her late husband's pension and a small inheritance from her own mother, structured deliberately so that neither my father nor my mother had any access to or knowledge of its existence. She'd done this, she explained, after watching my father struggle financially in his 20s in ways that had made her distrust his ability to prioritize long-term stability over short-term pressure. I never told your parents because I didn't want it treated as a safety net they could lean on irresponsibly, she said. I wanted it there specifically for you, when you needed it most, and I intended to reveal it when you were accepted somewhere and needed help covering costs beyond what aid would provide. Grandma, that's not the problem right now. The problem is I don't have applications to submit anymore. I know, she said. Which is why, this morning, I called an old friend of mine, Harold Whitfield, a lawyer I've known since your grandfather's estate work decades ago. Devon, what your parents did wasn't just cruel. Depending on how it's framed, deliberately destroying property that legally belongs to a minor, property representing significant financial value in terms of the labor and resources invested, may actually constitute something legally actionable, particularly given the trust fund complicates who exactly bears financial responsibility here. I sat in my grandmother's living room, trying to process the idea that what had happened to me might be something beyond a devastating parenting decision, something with actual legal weight. Harold thinks, my grandmother continued, that at minimum, we can document this thoroughly enough to support your case with individual schools directly, a formal letter explaining exactly what happened, potentially supported by documentation of family circumstances, that could open exceptions to standard deadline policies far more effectively than a vague, family emergency, claim from a 17-year-old alone. Harold Whitfield met with me and my grandmother 2 days later. He was precise, methodical, asking detailed questions about dates, about who exactly had witnessed the fireplace conversation, about whether any digital records existed anywhere beyond what my parents had destroyed. It turned out more existed than I'd initially realized. Dr. Halbrook, the community college professor who'd supervised my summer research, still had a complete copy of my supplement on his own drive, since I'd submitted a draft to him for feedback before finalizing it. 2 of my 3 recommendation letter writers had saved digital copies of what they'd submitted, since most schools' portals retain submission records on the teacher's end independent of my own files. My actual application essays, painstakingly reconstructed from memory with my grandmother's patient help over several evenings, ended up reading remarkably close to my original drafts, since I'd revised them so many times that the content had essentially become memorized. Harold drafted a formal letter, on his firm's letterhead, addressed to the admissions offices of all 6 schools, explaining that application materials had been destroyed due to a documented family conflict, that supporting evidence existed confirming the original work's completion prior to the incident, and formally requesting a short administrative extension to allow resubmission. 4 of the 6 schools granted the extension outright, treating it as a straightforward hardship accommodation once presented with a lawyer's formal documentation rather than a student's unverified claim. The 2 reach schools required additional verification, which Dr. Halbrook and my recommendation letter writers provided directly, confirming timeline and content independently of anything I could have fabricated after the fact. I resubmitted every application within the extended window, working nearly around the clock for 10 days, rebuilding 8 months of work in considerably less time, fueled by an anger that, I'll admit, made the essays sharper in places than the originals had been. My parents, throughout this entire process, had no idea any of it was happening. I didn't tell them about my grandmother's trust fund, about Harold Whitfield, about the extensions or the resubmissions. I continued attending school, continued the surface routine of our household, while quietly rebuilding an entire future they believed they'd successfully erased. The first sign my parents had that something wasn't going according to their plan arrived 3 months later, in the form of a thick acceptance envelope from one of my reach schools, delivered to our mailbox on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. My father found it before I did, sitting on the kitchen counter when I got home from school, his expression somewhere between confusion and dawning alarm. "Devon, what is this?" "It's an acceptance letter," I said, setting down my backpack. "From where?" I thought. He stopped, understanding beginning to cross his face in real time. "I thought you didn't have applications anymore." "I rebuilt them," I said. "All 6. With help you didn't know I had." My mother appeared in the doorway, her expression tightening as she processed what she was hearing. "Devon, what exactly did you do?" "I got extensions from every school, based on documentation of exactly what happened that Saturday." I have letters confirming my original essays and research supplement existed before you burned them. I have a lawyer's letter on file with every admissions office explaining the circumstances." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen behind them. "A lawyer," my father finally said. "You got a lawyer involved in this?" "My grandmother did," I said. "Because it turns out she's been protecting my future for 15 years in ways neither of you ever knew about, specifically because she never trusted either of you to protect it yourselves." My father's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then something like betrayal, then a controlled anger he seemed to be working hard to keep contained. "Your grandmother went behind our backs. She got a lawyer involved in our family's business without even talking to us first." "She talked to me," I said. "Because I called her the night I found my applications gone, and she was the only person in this entire family who actually helped instead of telling me to be patient and reapply next year like nothing significant had been lost." My mother's voice sharpened. "Devon, we are your parents. Whatever Rosalind did, she overstepped." "She didn't overstep. She stepped in, because the two of you had already made it clear you weren't going to." The acceptance letter sat on the kitchen counter between us for the rest of that conversation, a physical reminder that whatever plan my parents had constructed that Saturday afternoon had already, quietly, unraveled weeks earlier without their knowledge. Over the following 2 months, 4 more acceptance letters arrived, along with 2 rejections from schools where the extended timeline apparently hadn't been enough to overcome the competition in that particular applicant pool. Of the 4 acceptances, 2 came with substantial merit scholarships, reducing my actual cost of attendance to a fraction of what my family would otherwise have needed to cover. My grandmother, once the acceptances started arriving, finally revealed the trust fund directly to my parents, not out of any obligation to explain herself, she told me privately, but because she wanted the full financial picture on record before decisions got made about which school I'd actually attend. The conversation where she told my father about the trust fund happened at her house, with me present, at her specific request. "Anthony," she said, "I've had this money set aside for Devon's education since he was 12 years old. I never told you because I watched you make decisions with money throughout your 20s that made me distrust whether you'd protect it for its intended purpose if you knew it existed. What happened this fall confirmed I was right to keep it separate." My father sat very still, absorbing that information. "You've distrusted me for 15 years, and you never said anything." "I didn't need to say anything," my grandmother said. "I just needed to make sure Devon's future didn't depend entirely on your judgment in a moment like the one you created this fall. I chose, ultimately, one of the 2 reach schools that had accepted me with a meaningful scholarship, a pre-med program at a mid-sized university in Pennsylvania, roughly 6 hours from home, far enough to establish real independence, close enough to visit my grandmother regularly, which had become important to me in ways I hadn't fully anticipated before that fall. My relationship with my parents, in the immediate aftermath, remained strained in a way that took years, not months, to soften into something functional. My father, in particular, struggled to fully reckon with what he'd done, oscillating between periods of genuine remorse and periods of quiet resentment toward my grandmother for what he perceived as her interference rather than her protection. Nico, for his part, never fully understood the depth of what had happened that fall until years later, when he was old enough to piece together the full timeline himself. He apologized to me directly during my 2nd year of college, unprompted, during a visit home over winter break. "I didn't ask them to burn your applications," he said. "I want you to know that. I didn't even know it happened until way after, and by the time I found out, it felt like it was already done, like there wasn't anything useful I could say about it anymore. I believe you," I told him, and I meant it. Whatever my parents had done that fall, it had been their decision alone, born from a specific, misguided calculation about whose future deserved more protection in a single academic year, not something Nico had asked for or orchestrated himself. I completed my undergraduate degree in 4 years, graduated with honors, and was accepted into a competitive post-baccalaureate research program the following year, eventually pursuing a graduate track in biomedical research that traced directly back to the independent Project Drive. Halbrook had supervised the summer before everything happened, the same research supplement my parents had burned, and that his saved digital copy had ultimately helped preserve. My grandmother passed away 2 years after I graduated, and in her will, the remaining balance of the trust fund transferred directly to me, along with a handwritten letter she'd apparently prepared years earlier, explaining her reasoning in her own words for the first time in writing. Devon, I built this fund because I believed, even when you were very young, that you had something in you worth protecting carefully, deliberately, from decisions other people might make under pressure. I'm sorry it took a crisis to reveal why I never told your parents. I hope, whatever you build with the rest of this, you remember that protecting your own future sometimes means trusting people outside the family you were born into, when the family itself fails to trust you the way it should. I think about that fireplace often, the specific, deliberate quiet of a Saturday afternoon while I sat unaware in a library 3 miles away, believing my future was simply waiting for me to finish it. I think about how completely that single afternoon could have ended everything I'd worked 8 months to build, if not for a grandmother who'd spent 15 years quietly protecting a version of my future my parents never even knew existed. I don't know if my parents and I will ever fully repair what that fall broke. Some damage, I've come to understand, doesn't fully heal into something that looks like it never happened. It just becomes something you learn to carry differently, alongside everything you managed to build anyway, despite it.